And is the presentation?
I said you can share again. All right.
All right. So thank you all so much for being here today. I really appreciate you taking the time at 6 p.m. on a Thursday night to be here to learn a little bit more about this research. This is going to be awkward because I don't have a view here, so I have to do this a lot. So first of all, I would like to thank a number of individuals. First of all, the 7 participants who took part in the study. The 7 participants who took part in the study that I will be discussing today. A number of former students, some of whom are here. So thank you so much for your contribution to the very early stages of this research and brainstorming and doing literature reviews for it. Also, we're going to have a panel after I finish yapping. So thank you so much you're here. So Jennifer, Rain, Anais, and Jacobo. So we'll be having a discussion in about 30 minutes, if I manage the 30 minutes I allocated. And lastly, last but not least, to the interpreting team. So thank you so much for your help. So Danielle, Joao, Aretha, Maria, Dana, Marilisa, and I had deleted your name because I wasn't sure you were coming.
She's here, Olena.
Olena. So thank you so much for your interpreting power. So a little bit about the event today. I'll talk about my positionality as a researcher, which is something I really like to start when I give any talk about my research, especially because I don't necessarily belong to the trans and non-binary community. So it's really important for me to do that. A bit about today's event. I'll talk as briefly as I can about the background literature, the methods, the key findings, some recommendations, and then we'll move on to the panel discussion. So a bit about me. I'm a senior lecturer here at London Met in the psychology school. Some of you who are my students know that. I also am part of the committee or steering committee for the Gender and Sexual Diversity Research Group, which also helped put together this event. And I also co-lead the LGBT staff network at the university. I always like to joke that I just like doing gay stuff in my job. And this research was awarded some money from the university a couple of years ago. So this is just really showing the research process all the way to the end. And I'll be talking about the future steps a little bit as well. As I said, my positionality, I'm a researcher. My research draws from psychology, but also from sociology and sometimes from sociolinguistics, although not so much for this research. In 2022, I published a book on non-binary gender identities, and I also had an event like this, but without the interpreting. I wish I had done that. My positionality, both as an activist, as a researcher, and as a person, really is to be a queer and feminist researcher who is trans affirming and also trans inclusive. And my research really seeks to represent the plurality of lived experience rather than, just one window for everyone. And I am part of the queer community. I am a cis gay man. Sometimes I do use queer to identify myself. And I am part of the Latin American community. I was born in Colombia and I migrated to the US when I was 16, hence the Americanized accent. All right, so this research was published in the Journal of Homosexuality about 2 months ago. I do have two co-researchers. So Sasha, who couldn't be here today, was my research assistant. They're a non-binary person from Spain, and Guilherme Fiorini, who is a researcher in mental health studies and is also from Brazil. And he conducted a lot of the interviews in Portuguese. So something I really like to, I know I'm doing a lot of introductions here before I get to the juice and the meat of the discussion, is that today's event is really to outline some research that I've done with my team about non-binary or with non-binary and trans Latin Americans living in London. But this event is not a debate about the existence of trans and non-binary people. So I just like to set that expectation that we're not debating people's lives. We're saying these are their experiences. So you may not be familiar with some of the language that I may disclose, and that's okay. That's part of the conversation that we're aiming to have. So I do expect everyone to keep a respectful and affirming stance towards gender diversity. And also a few notes. So if you wanted to ask a question, please state your name if you want, but at least state your pronouns so that the interpreters know your pronouns and don't misgender you when they do the interpreting. And they're going to be doing their best to use gender inclusive language in both Spanish and Portuguese and Italian and Ukrainian. But if you're listening and they don't get it completely right, it's just, this is part of the learning experience in doing interpreting using gender neutral language or gender inclusive language rather. I always also like to provide some context and basic definitions about what I mean by trans and non-binary people. So these are individuals whose gender identities or expressions do not exclusively or necessarily align with the gender they were assigned at birth. So that's kind of the technical definition. So trans and non-binary people continue to face increased risks of discrimination and psychological distress worldwide, but in the UK context, trans and non-binary people face various levels of societal exclusion and violence, which are often driven by anti-trans rhetoric, which is actually very much present right now and has been growing, I would say, for the last 5 years. According to the Trans Life survey in the UK, there's been a 200% rise in violent crimes reported by trans and non-binary people in the UK. And 70% of these respondents encountered transphobia in healthcare settings. 40% of them felt that their general practitioner, did not understand their needs. 57% avoided going to the GP altogether when feeling unwell. And obviously, all of these experiences are restricting their access to not just healthcare, but other areas of society. So for this research, I am tapping into the area of queer migration, which is actually something that I'm new at, sometimes called LGBTQ migration. And this is really to understand not just the economic reasons why queer people, when I say queer, I mean LGBTQ plus people, migrate, to find jobs or to find better access to education and so on, but also aims to understand the reasons for migrating that may relate to their genders and sexualities as well. And so the area of queer, or sometimes called sexual migration, but I think sexual is quite limiting because we're also talking about gender, examines this link between migration and queerness. And also looking at ways in which migration can help shape or reshape sexual and gender practices amongst queer people who migrate. And of course, there are reasons to migrate, such as seeking environments which queer people may perceive as being more welcoming or more opening to their identities. So we know that queer people prefer going to places like New York, to LA, and obviously London, which is the focus of this research, often, especially for Latin American people, to escape religious and familial expectations and to escape the pressures, especially for the Latin American context, of machismo, dominant Catholic ideologies, strong family structures, and heteronormative and cisnormative social norms. And of course, it's important to note that aside from these reasons, both economic and in terms of identity, people may also be displaced or migrate as a survival strategy. So according to the Transgender EU Trans Murders Monitoring Survey, unfortunately, Latin America and the Caribbean is overly represented in the number of murders of trans people, accounting for 70% of all global cases, and Brazil being amongst the highest one with 30% of total murders. And this is due to various reasons, but including misogyny, racism, xenophobia, horophobia, and unfortunately, most victims tend to be Black trans women of color, and trans sex workers. Now, I do want to note that while this paints a picture of Latin America as being really bad for trans and non-binary people, there's also some progress that has occurred in a number of countries where trans people, for instance, can change their names and legal documents without needing surgery or extensive legal procedures. So this include Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, and so on. But the enforcement of some of these trans-affirming laws can vary depending on whether you're in an urban setting or a rural setting, for example. And places like Paraguay and Venezuela have no specific legal protections or anti-discrimination laws for trans people. Now, when it comes to research about queer people or queer Latin American migrants in London, the research is very limited. I only encountered one paper that looked at gay men in London. And they found through a qualitative exploration, such as the one I did, of 14 Latin American gay men in London, that these men prefer London for being perceived as being more anonymous, multicultural, and the super or hyper diversity of London. And many of them were critical of their native cities or countries for being too traditional, less anonymous. So anonymity was a really important concept here. More homogeneous in terms of the way of thinking and acting, and the small and familiar networks, which sometimes they found as being quite oppressive. And as a result, for these individuals in the London context, they tended to avoid Latin American culture, venues, and people in favor of queer venues and people. And I really relate to that. So when I read that, it really resonated with my experience as well. And this is also due to the idea that London and other metropolitan cities are perceived as a gay haven. So something, a place where queerness can be enacted and can be accepted and valued and so on. So again, they held strong connections with queer culture, venues, and people, which aided in their process of sexual and gender resocialization, which is a concept I borrowed from Valenzuela on this research, which is how individuals who migrate come to diversify their sexual and gender practices in that process of migration, namely by challenging the normativities that were ingrained within Latin American culture, and maybe even talking about taboo issues that back in Latin America, they weren't able to really talk about and disclose, such as heteronormative gender roles, discussions about sexual health, And as a result, many of these participants in this research constructed their identity as gay first and Latino second, which I thought was really interesting, that they kind of prioritize their queer or gay identity in favor of, because of the benefits it provided to them. A little bit more context, I'll get to my research, I promise. The experiences of Latin American migrants in the UK are underexplored. I wouldn't say there isn't research, there is some, and I've read a lot of it by some, you see the same names over and over when you explore the research of Latin American people. I don't know how accurate these numbers are. It's probably more because Latin American people are one of the fastest growing populations in the UK. And they account for about 500,000 of the population, or there's 500,000 of them in the UK, and half of which live in London. So London is really kind of a central hub, which is why I decided to just focus on London for this research. And most Latin American migrants in London work in low-pay, precarious jobs, mainly cleaning and catering sectors. And they are vulnerable to poverty and to lack of access to education and exploitation and wage theft. Oh yeah, these are some of the famous names that I always see when we talk about Latin American research in the UK. Therefore, I always tell my students to have a good therefore statement. Therefore, this research aimed to understand how trans and non-binary Latin American migrants in London navigate their processes of migration and their gender identities in that context, and also to examine the emotional impacts of these experiences of migration and being in London. And also, just based on that previous research, how they engaged with Latin American culture and communities, as well as queer communities. To do this, I drew from two theories. I married them, if you will, intersectionality theory and minority stress theory. So intersectionality, which maybe you've heard before, is kind of a buzzword, really is looking at systems of oppression and how systems of oppression overlap or intersect. Sometimes people talk about it in the context of identity. You know, if you identify as a woman, if you identify as a lesbian, if you identify as a Black person, and so how all those come together. And that's part of it, but really is an examination of systems of oppression. And in this case, I'm looking at systems such as transphobia and xenophobia. And minority stress theory is a psychological theory that looks into how discrimination, and namely also systems of oppression, can create psychological stressors for individuals, which affect their mental health, particularly for minoritized populations. And it also uses the concept of resilience, which is quite a contested term, but I drew upon it to understand how individuals come together and affiliate themselves to different identities in order to cope with some of those stressors. So marrying the two allowed me to understand how the systems of oppression and societal structures sometimes compound to create different stress, mental health issues, and how people cope with those in terms of resilience. Okay, so now my data. So I interviewed 7 people. As you can see here, most of them were either women or non-binary people. I tried to recruit 10, if not more, but it was really difficult to recruit for various reasons, which we can discuss later on. Most participants had lived here an average of 6 years, although one participant had been here for a year and a half, and the longest one was 23 years. They needed to have lived in the UK for at least 1 year. to be able to participate. The interviews were conducted in English, some of them in Spanish and some of them in Portuguese. And I used something called walking interviews, although only three of the interviews occurred using walking interviews, which I wanted to experiment with because it's a way to negotiate the power dynamics that often exists when you interview someone. When you walk, you feel like you're walking with a friend, and the power dynamics are a bit different. So I did find that with those interviews, but not everyone wanted to do the walk-in interviews. Obviously, also for other reasons, such as safety and so on. So I took that into consideration and offered different avenues. So these are my findings. I'm going to try to go through most of them. So first of all, Latin American culture and family dynamics. So most participants talked about feeling the pressure to conform to traditional conservative gender roles in Latin America. And this was one of the reasons why many of them decided to leave due to this family rejection when they didn't conform to those systems or to those ways of being. So just an example here of one of the participants who said that, she decided to leave the country because, the family expectations was for her to marry a woman, and this is not something that she wanted to do. And so she felt as though, if she didn't leave, she would end up dead. So many of them also in the Latin American context experience discrimination and violence. And if they didn't, they live with a constant fear that if they dressed or if they enacted their genders in the ways that they wanted to, that they would be facing violence consequences. So Carmen here says that in Mexico, she was afraid that someone would yell at her or attack her. But she commented, if she passed as a cisgender woman, she would probably face less violence. But she's here going a couple of steps ahead. This is not something that she faces as much in the context in the UK. And these experiences really led most participants to distance themselves, and I'm very careful with this distancing because it's distancing from Latin American culture and people, and that distancing really is both physical through the process of migration, but also cultural and breaking those familial ties with some of their family members. And many of them were really seeking a safer space, so distancing themselves from religion as well and from traditional contexts. So Anna here again talks about, having distanced herself from this process, but she talked about it in the context of being programmed. So something that she experienced throughout her life, and it took her over 10 years to deprogram herself and to actually come to terms and let Anna come to life. So migration, therefore, was offering them a sense of freedom. So once they moved to the UK or to London specifically, they had more leverage to explore their identities in a context where they were breaking away from those familiar expectations. And facing less stigma as a result that was associated with those contexts. So Sam here talks about, once they were able to leave those contexts, how, the social past has a lot of weight in Latin America, and how once they left that, they also left the stigma that was surrounding that experience. So in terms of, well, this is all connected, but gender resocialization then was an opportunity to explore and learn more about gender identities in a safe space, in a way that they felt was safer, and also finding, therefore, a vocabulary. I don't have that quote here, but there was a really wonderful quote about a participant who found the language of what non-binary meant, and that really all clicked in terms of them finding themselves as a non-binary person. And also the language of freedom and also being reborn after that process of migration. And related to this, and this is kind of the benefits of migration as well, many of them found that their quality of life increased, and they were able to access important things like healthcare compared to their native countries in terms of both sexual health and gender affirming health, and also more financial freedom. So these were some of the benefits. So for instance, Isabel here says that she now has regular checkups for HIV, and also has been able to access gender affirming hormones, which in her home country in Bolivia, her and her friends were injecting other types of hormones over the counter, which were actually not for them. And it was actually making them sick. So, she felt as though being here really provided her those benefits. Nonetheless, being in the UK also came with a number of challenges. So many of them experience a combination of xenophobia and transphobia in healthcare, which affected their psychological well-being. Some of this was mediated by language barriers. So sometimes they just were unable to communicate with their doctors that they were trans and the needs that they had. Others were simply misgendered, even in places where they weren't supposed to, such as accessing gender affirming health through the NHS. Which again had mental health consequences. So Carmen here says that the medical system in the UK for trans people is very difficult, humiliating, and dehumanizing, especially when you're an immigrant. She was trying to get help because she was feeling suicidal at the time. And all they did was tell her to call a number and wait 3 months. So she had really bad panic attacks. And she had to go into private therapy because she wasn't able to access therapy here. So she had to pay out of pocket. And obviously money was tight as well. In terms of employment opportunities, quite similar challenges. So some of them disclosed or talked about losing jobs during transition. So, when their employers found out that they were trans, and they would have issues and sometimes sack them, or many of them feared being outed at work. So they were transitioning and lived as women or non-binary people outside of work, but in the work settings were in the closet, if you will. So there was a fear of disclosure. Most of which, all of this were moderated by education, by language, and by the social capital. So I didn't talk about this in the first slide with the participants, but there was a wide range of educational levels and socioeconomic levels as well within the participants. So the participants who had fewer levels of education didn't fare as well in these domains. So Anna here says that the main challenge I had here was when I was transitioning. Getting a job was very difficult. People really never said anything to my face, but you can sense why they don't hire you. But once she had some surgeries, things got a little bit better. So this concept of passing as well, when society recognizes you as a woman or as a man, life, unfortunately, or fortunately mostly, but because of that system, I'm saying unfortunately, does get easier. On a positive note, many of them, not all of them, but many of them did have strong support systems, mostly through LGBT communities and organizations, such as charities. Even nightlife was really important. which was a really great source of, connecting with people, having information and resources, and having a sense of belonging in a foreign context. So, Kai here says that the queer community is so nice, that they're all very lovely. And, so I think the queer community is part of my identity, which is really important to them here. Some of them also were very active in activism, queer activism, and I'm arguing that this is a form of community resilience for them. So, helping others and being active in queer activism for them kind of counter the negative effects of discrimination, just being able to help others and being active within the queer community and offering that sense of belonging. So Sam here says that the people who work in activism here from the Latin, queer, and HIV perspective recognize me as a non-binary person, and that's very affirming. So again, it's all about systems of support and how that can help individuals. And many of them also commented for the need of intersectional thinking in the way that services operate. So, many of them wonder, where do they fit in? Because when they try to access services within the Latin American community, they felt that they didn't belong in those communities because there weren't services catered for them. And if they went to kind of a trans or LGBT organization, there wasn't a lot of resources in Spanish, for instance, or people who had knowledge about Latin American communities to be able to help them. So there wasn't a kind of an intersection of both, which we can talk during the panel discussion. So of course, and vice versa. And in terms of sexual health, they felt that many services were offered catered to gay people, particularly to gay men, but lacked resources for trans people. So Isabel here says that there is a lack of support for trans women, and she calls for the community to fight, to unite as equal, where gay community, trans, and lesbians are all the same, and there shouldn't be so much division. So just to kind of summarize the findings, many escaped oppressive cultural and familiar context, which often put a lot of pressure for traditional gender roles and sexual roles in particular. Migration provided many of them with identity affirmations via gender resocializations, which often help facilitate their access to healthcare and diverse queer safe spaces, but that despite some of these positive aspects of migration, they still faced a great deal of ongoing systemic challenges in the UK, such as transphobia and xenophobia, which actually continue to grow. This proposed legislation in the UK now for or against trans rights and also against migration and immigrant rights. So it's an ongoing battle, and things are unfortunately on those grounds not getting better. So this, of course, continues to contribute to barriers in healthcare and employment, and definitely impact psychological well-being. But we're underscoring here the importance of queer community support systems and activism as forms of resilience to mitigate some of the effects of discrimination. So how can we better support these communities who are being affected by these oppressive systems on various different domains, not just one? And that's kind of the idea of intersectionality here. But I do want to end with this kind of message, which I mentioned already, but I do want to stress it, that sometimes migration stories depict Latin America as fully homophobic and fully regressive, while portraying the UK and the US or the West as being inherently more tolerant, which is, it's been called something homonationalism, this idea that we're looking at the West through this lens where we're saying, oh, we're doing so much better. But the reality is that it's not true. And there is some progress in Latin America when it comes to queer rights, including legislation of same-sex marriage, which is a whole different domain, and some anti-discrimination protections, and that homophobia and transphobia and the way that they're enacted in Latin America, but also worldwide, really depends by region and is not uniform. So I'm not depicting Latin America and demonizing it because it's much more complex than that. And of course, that these oppressive systems, as I just highlighted, also exist in the UK. And they tend to or continue to expose trans people and non-binary people to violence, to economic struggles, and to mental health issues. So, of course, I recommend developing more culturally sensitive and intersectional healthcare and social practices, fostering inclusive spaces and safe spaces that recognize both queer identities and Latin American identities, promoting more intersectional research and advocacy. I think that there's lots of misconceptions about how to apply intersectionality in research. And I hope I've done it semi-successfully because that's a big question for, especially in psychology. They're always like, how do you apply that? Hopefully I did a good job applying it. And then, of course, acknowledging the various different layers of oppression and identity in that intersection. So thank you for listening. I'm going to stop the recording now. If you could help me, please.